Everyone tells you to buy gold when the money dies, but nobody tells you how people who owned gold still lost everything, not because gold failed them, because they failed gold. In every hyperinflation of the last century, people who held gold made the same catastrophic mistakes over and over again. They bought wrong, held wrong, stored wrong, and sold at the worst possible moment. And if you don't understand what those mistakes are, you're going to repeat them. Welcome to the financial system. Control the money, control the history. And remember, simple is never easy. The first and most devastating mistake is buying gold too late. People don't think about gold when things are stable. They think about it when bread doubles in price and their savings are melting. By then, the worst has already happened, not to the economy, but to the price of gold itself. When panic sets in, gold doesn't just rise, it explodes. And the people buying in panic are paying the highest premiums in history to sellers who bought years earlier. In Weimar Germany, this played out with surgical cruelty. Between 1918 and 1923, the mark lost virtually all its value. A loaf of bread that cost half a mark before the war cost over 200 billion marks by November 1923. Gold, priced in marks, rose by trillions of percent. But most Germans didn't start buying gold until 1922, when inflation was already visible. By then, premiums on gold coins had tripled. Dealers charged enormous spreads because demand was desperate. Workers who finally converted their wages into gold in late 1922 paid 5, 10, sometimes 20 times what the same coins had cost 2 years earlier, not because gold's value had changed, but because the panic premium had consumed most of the value they were trying to protect. They bought safety, but they bought it at the price of poverty. The lesson is brutal and mathematical. Gold doesn't protect you if you buy it after the crisis is priced in. Protection is purchased in calm, not in chaos. Every hyperinflation rewards the early and punishes the late. The second mistake is more dangerous because it disguises itself as intelligence. It's holding paper gold instead of physical metal. In stable times, gold ETFs, certificates, and futures contracts all seem like reasonable ways to own gold. They're liquid, convenient, and avoid the hassle of storage. But during hyperinflation, paper gold is not gold. It's a promise, and promises are exactly what hyperinflation destroys. In 1933, the United States government made it a crime for citizens to own gold. Executive Order 6102 forced Americans to surrender their gold at $20.67 an ounce. Less than a year later, the government revalued gold to $35, a 40% devaluation of the dollar overnight. People who held gold certificates, who trusted paper claims on metal sitting in bank vaults, had no recourse. Their gold was confiscated through the very institutions they'd trusted to store it. The certificates became worthless receipts from metal the government had already taken. This pattern repeated in Lebanon. In 2019, when the banking system collapsed, citizens who had gold accounts in Lebanese banks discovered their gold existed only as entries on a spreadsheet. The banks froze withdrawals. People who thought they owned gold actually owned a bank's promise to give them gold, a promise that evaporated the moment the system cracked. Those who held physical coins at home could still buy food, still pay rent, still survive. Those who held paper claims stood in line outside locked doors, begging for access to wealth that no longer existed. The distinction is not academic. In a functioning economy, paper gold and physical gold behave identically. In a collapsing one, they diverge completely. Physical gold is an asset. Paper gold is a counterparty risk wearing a golden mask. The third mistake destroys the most wealth, and nobody warns you about it. It's selling gold too early. Hyperinflation doesn't move in a straight line. It moves in waves. There are periods where the currency stabilizes briefly, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. Governments announce reforms. Central banks raise rates. Politicians promise austerity. And in those brief windows of apparent recovery, people sell their gold, convinced the worst is over. In Weimar Germany, this happened repeatedly between 1921 and 1923. Each time the mark stabilized briefly, gold holders sold, converting back into marks to take advantage of what looked like recovery. Each time, inflation returned worse than before. The German government deliberately engineered these pauses, temporary stabilizations designed to shake out gold holders and restore confidence in the mark. It worked. Millions of Germans traded real wealth for temporary comfort, then watched helplessly as the next wave obliterated what remained. Zimbabwe repeated this pattern 80 years later. Between 2006 and 2008, the Zimbabwean dollar collapsed in stages. Each stage was punctuated by government announcements, new currency denominations, promises of reform, temporary price controls, and each time people who held gold were tempted to convert back, to believe the system was healing. It wasn't. Inflation reached 89.7 sextillion%. Prices doubled every single day. Those who held gold through every false recovery emerged intact. Those who sold during the pauses were destroyed. Hyperinflation doesn't announce its departure. It retreats, regroups, and returns with greater force. Selling in the middle is worse than never buying at all, because you've spent real money to acquire something you then gave away for worthless paper at the worst possible moment. The fourth mistake is keeping gold where institutions can reach it. Safety deposit boxes, allocated storage accounts, even government-approved vaults all feel secure in normal times. But in a crisis, the government and the banks are not your allies. They are drowning, and drowning institutions will grab anything within reach. In Argentina, which has lived through repeated currency collapses across 4 decades, citizens learned this the hardest way. In 2001, the government froze all bank accounts in what became known as the corralito. Savings, foreign currency holdings, and gold stored in bank vaults were all locked away. People who had diversified perfectly on paper, gold, dollars, pesos, found that none of it mattered because every asset sat inside an institution that had just slammed its doors shut. The only Argentines who preserved wealth held assets outside the banking system entirely: physical gold at home, cash in foreign accounts, or property they could access without anyone's permission. This is the pattern history screams at. When a system collapses, the first thing governments do is lock down the financial infrastructure. They freeze accounts, they impose capital controls, they restrict withdrawals. And if your gold is sitting inside that infrastructure, it is no longer yours. It belongs to whoever controls the vault. And in a crisis, that is always the state. The fifth mistake is the most subtle and perhaps the most important. It's misunderstanding what gold is actually for. Gold is not an investment. It doesn't pay dividends. It doesn't generate cash flow. It doesn't grow. What gold does is survive. It crosses the gap between one monetary system and the next. Its job isn't to make you richer during the collapse. Its job is to carry your purchasing power through the collapse and out the other side. The people in Weimar Germany who used gold wisely didn't trade it for bread in 1922. They held it until the Rentenmark stabilized the currency in late 1923. Then they converted, buying property, businesses, and assets at prices that reflected a broken economy. They emerged wealthier than before the crisis, not because gold made them rich, but because gold kept them solvent while everyone else went bankrupt. That's the purpose of gold in hyperinflation, not profit, survival, and the position to rebuild when the system resets. Gold doesn't fail during hyperinflation. People fail gold. They buy it in panic instead of in preparation. They hold paper claims instead of physical metal. They sell too early, fooled by temporary stability. They store it inside the very institutions that will lock them out. And they treat it like a trade instead of what it really is, a bridge between the world that's dying and the one that comes next. History doesn't repeat, but it punishes those who refuse to learn. The Weimar savers who sold early, the Americans who surrendered their gold in 1933, the Lebanese who trusted bank vaults, the Argentines who believed the system would protect them. They all made the same mistake. They understood that gold was valuable. They just didn't understand how to hold it. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. Its financial system and history leaves clues. I show you where the money leads.